Hi, good afternoon, good morning, good evening, everyone. Welcome to today's webinar on manual handling assessments using the VMAC tool. This webinar is a follow-on from our previous webinar on the HSE manual handling charts and the MAC tool. I'm Lee Bennett, Vice Chair of the IOSH Logistics and Retail Group. According to the HSE summary statistics for last year, for 2020, there were 480,000 workers suffering with work-related musculoskeletal disorders, and there are 8.9 million working days lost due to work-related musculoskeletal disorders. On today's webinar, I'm pleased to welcome our guest speaker, Dr Andrew Pinder, who's Senior Ergonomist with the HSE Science Directorate. Andrew will be discussing the HSE's VMAC tool, which is a tool for assessing manual handling operations where weights vary. Today's your session, so I would urge you to get involved with the chat. There's a chat box to the right of the screen where you can chat with other people on the session. And we also have a Q&A box at the bottom, where if you put your questions in there, I'll put those to Andrew at the end of the session. So we'll try to get through as many questions as we can, so please do have a think of some questions for Andrew towards the end. So on with today's webinar, it gives me great pleasure to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. Andrew Pinder. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks, Lee, and it's very kind of you to invite me to speak. I've been with HSE for quite a long time now and been involved in dealing with issues around manual handling for pretty well all of that time. So I like to think I know something about it, and I have colleagues who are also involved. So we seek, and we do seek to provide tools which help people manage risk and do assessments to do them. So you had the previous session from a colleague of mine, I think Chris Quarry, about the MAC tool. The variable MAC, the VMAC, is something I developed a number of years ago. It resulted from a query from environmental health officers who had found a warehouse which was, I think that it'd be fair to say, a problem site, and they were confronted by a lot of heavy loads of quite variable weights, and they tried using the MAC tool on it and realized it didn't work. So came to us for help. So if I share my screen, I've got a PowerPoint presentation I'm going to run through, which will hopefully give you a flavour of what the VMAC can do for you. And you can, and at the end there'll be I'll show a link to where you can download it from the HSE website. So if I just Right, so the issue is to do with variable load and frequency manual handling. And as I'm sure a lot of you are aware, there are duties under the 1992 manual handling operations regulations to do with the control of risk from manual handling. And it's a standard kind of hierarchy that we're familiar with in the UK, to do with avoiding hazardous operations, and this wonderful acronym we've got, so far as is reasonably practicable or practical. It's a legal phrase. Basically, it means you've got to try and do as much as you can, but we're not unreasonable. And if things can't be avoided, then you need to do an assessment. And then once you've done the assessment, there's a requirement to try and reduce the risk of injury, again, as far as is reasonably practicable. And then the obvious longer term things of monitoring and reviewing what's happening in the workplace in case things change, and managing the workplace to ensure that the people you're employing there are actually following your safe procedures to work safely, and to ensure their own safety and that of their colleagues and anybody else they may come in contact with. And the image on the right is the cover of the most recent edition of HSE's guidance on manual handling, which we refer to as L23, and it contains both the text of the regulations and quite detailed guidance from that HSE has written, and that was revised in 2016. Now, one thing that we developed a number of years ago, as you know, was the VMAC tool, and this is the most recent edition, which went online in 2018, and the print version was produced in 2019. And the VMAC has a number of flowcharts in it, and it uses a traffic light approach to indicate the level of risk from any individual risk factor. It covers 3 types of manual handling: lifting by one person, lifting and carrying by one person, and team handling, which can involve both lifting and carrying. Team handling is obviously much less common than single person handling, but it is an important one. And we're well aware there are lots of other kinds of more complicated types of manual handling that the VMAC tool doesn't cover. So, but when you need to do a risk assessment, there is guidance in L23 on how to deal with those kind of issues. And each flowchart has an assessment guide for the different types of handling. And the issue around variable handling is usually to do with variable loads and variable rates or frequencies. And if you look at the normal VMAC, then the assumption is that you're dealing with a fixed weight at a fixed frequency. So you can say, right, my load is, in this case, about 23 kilos, and somebody's handling it once every 2 minutes. That's in the amber zone. So that then is the first stage of your assessment. You say load frequency for lifting is amber. I'll finish the assessment for the other factors, and then I'll start thinking about what I can do about reducing risk. That's great, so long as the thing is real. Sorry, but it's using data for fixed frequencies from a laboratory or multiple laboratories. This is an experiment we did a number of years ago now. We asked people to pick up a load at a fixed frequency. First person was once every 5 seconds. This is once every 14 seconds, and find what's called the maximum acceptable weight. So there's quite a lot of data out there gathered over the years, particularly in America, which gives us very useful data for this kind of thing. Now, the problem is that the real world is rather messy when you get out into, say, a warehouse. These images are somewhat artificial, but you can see the variety of, sorry, this is rather noisy. You can see the variety of loads that the guy was handling, and the frequencies were not realistic, but for the purposes I needed the video for, that was okay. But to illustrate the fact that loads in a real warehouse can be extremely variable. Obviously, it depends on the kind of warehousing you're dealing with. I mean, if you're picking large amounts of cartons in a food distribution warehouse, it'd be very different to this kind of spare parts warehouse. Sorry, let's get on to the next one. Now, as I said, the VMAC assumes that the same load is handled all day, and often that's not the case. people will handle in bursts. They will do different activities through the day, and in some organisations, people rotate between different jobs. So what they do for the first couple of hours might then change to something completely different for the next couple of hours. So, and if you look at if you're thinking about if loads are variable, you could take the average load, but that ignores the highest load levels, and can be very heavy lifts that can be the most risky. But if you just look at the highest load and say, oh, we'll treat it as if someone's handling that load all day, every day at this frequency, then you're probably overscoring the risk, because if the average is much less, then you're overestimating the cumulative load, the total load. So as a result, I developed the VMAC as a way of assessing variable handling, and it's basically a spreadsheet which you can use with the Mac to assess variable weight frequency handling. And there's various tabs. There's a couple of tabs that three tabs you can see, one of which is where you put your data in, and then there's two results tabs, one for shifts up to 8 hours and one for shifts up to between 8 and 12 hours. There's no real difference. It's just to make it easier to see what's on the different tabs. And what it does is it shows the loads you've handled. You put them into the white boxes in the spreadsheet, and it will tell you the number of times a particular weight of load has been handled. Everything is rounded to a kilogram, and it gives you some summary statistics to show how the load is distributed. And then it uses the same color bands as the Mac to assess risk. So it's designed to integrate with the Mac. So what I did was I took the Mac graph, and you've got the load going up the graph up on the left on the y-axis, and the frequency of lift going across the x-axis horizontally. So I turned it round. So we've now got the load going across the bottom of the x-axis and the frequency going up. And I've changed lifts per hour into lifts per shift. The color code, the color bands, the shades are slightly different, but basically they mean the same. And that's very, very deliberate. So you can use the VMAC to assess the load, weight and frequency risk. So you start off with the first factor in the Mac flowchart. You think, no, this is variable. I'm going off to the VMAC. Once you've got your output from the VMAC, you can then go back to the main Mac flowchart and do the other risk, assess the other risk factors. So all the VMAC does is replace the first factor in the Mac for load and frequency for the situations when things are variable. And the kind of things you need to know to use it successfully, you need to pick jobs that happen regularly, not the one-off thing where you've got an unusual delivery and everyone piles in to help manually unload everything off the trailer. So you need to also look at workers that are basically doing manual handling full time and do not perform many other activities. So it's best if you don't really deal with the workers that aren't that are only coming into to cover overtime, etc. The VMAC can only cope with single person handling. I suspect the amount of team handling it could be useful for is probably fairly limited, but if you do find it, then I'd be interested to hear. You need workers who handle items of variable weight, and you need some workers that are representative of the workforce, because you're looking at what some individuals handled over the shift. So if you've got a one-off a task that only one person does, then the VMAC will probably be less use. And because there's variability between people, I recommend not looking at just one person. It's very difficult to give a figure for how many you should look at, but in general, we suggest you look at 3 to get an idea of the variability between the people in that particular job. And you want people who are experienced. So if you've got temporary agency staff in your workforce, it's probably best if you don't look at them, as they may be still learning the ropes, and they may have lower pick targets, so they wouldn't be expected to achieve the full rates that the experienced staff would. You need to know how long the shift is. Total shift length is including breaks, so 8 hours, 10 hours, 12 hours, etc. Then you need to get, this is the difficult bit, this is where it's potentially challenging. You need to obtain the weights of the items the individual handled over the shift. If you've got a warehouse, if you're in a warehouse, then hopefully your warehouse management system will be able to output that data for you in a form that you can copy and paste into the Excel spreadsheet. I really would not recommend going around weighing every item. In some situations where you've got pallets of standard items, then you'll have a clear idea of what was on the pallet. So it may be 500 cases weighing 15 kilos, say, and then the next pallet might be boxes all weighing 25 kilos or whatever. And you need to make sure that you're dealing with items that weigh more than 2.5 kilos. The VMAC really won't tell you anything useful about very light items. If you are dealing with light items only, then we'd recommend that you consider using the ART tool for assessment of repetitive tasks. And you also need to make sure that you've got sufficient range in the weight. If everything weighs the same, the VMAC really won't tell you anything. You'd just be wasting effort. So we'd recommend that you have an absolute minimum difference between the smallest and largest weights of 2 kilograms. So what you do is you get hold of your data, you copy and paste from your computer system, if possible, into the spreadsheet. And we recommend that there's 16 columns in here with, I think, 500 rows per each. So you can put a lot of data in there. The general recommendation is use 1 column per task. So if it's unloading a vehicle and you know the weights from that vehicle, then you put that in vehicle 1 in column 1, vehicle 2, column 2. You can change the names to suit yourself. Or if it's palletizing, you could depalletizing or palletizing. Again, you can do the same kind of thing. And if a task involves carrying, you can add that as the average carry distance as well. That again depends on the task. There is a correction in the output graphs which does take into account carry distance. It effectively converts it into an equivalent number of lifts, depending on which is a measure of the energy required. And you then need to pick your correct shift length tab. It's between 4 and 8 hours or 8 to 12 hours. There's two different ways of getting there. The links on the left or the tabs down at the bottom of the workbook. In the tab, there's an output box, and you need to put the actual shift length into that. And when you follow the link to the output tab, you'll see that bars appear with a number above them, telling you the number of lifts of each weight. So in this graph, you've got 17 items being handled that weigh 25 kilos and 22 items that weigh 30 kilos. So you're getting an idea of the distribution of the weights in 1 kilo categories. And the basic idea with making sense of the graphs is you want to get as many loads as possible into the green region because that's safer. So what you do is you start at the heavy end, the 50, where the purple region, which is 50 kilos, depending on the frequency, and work your way back down towards the green. So you look for the heaviest load. In this set of data, there's 3 loads weighing 32 kilos. So you might then say, well, we've got these loads here. What do we do? What are they? Why do we handle them? Can we change something to make it safer? I mean, an obvious thing would be, is it possible to split the load into 2? If it's a particularly heavy item and there's very few, could it be handled mechanically, or is team handling an option? And as I said, the VMAC uses exactly the same definitions of risk as the MAC. So you can see that in this case, the biggest load is amber, and you've got medium level of risk, examine tasks closely, consider reducing the item weights or reducing the number of lifts per day of these items. And the other thing you get, which besides the summary box, is the graph with the summary statistics on it, which is the tall vertical bars, and you get averages. Now, one of the things that puzzled me at school a little was the teachers insisted on telling me there were 3 kinds of average, but then we never really made any use of anything other than the mean, what most people call the average. But in this case, the other types are actually useful. So the mean load is the dark blue. And in this set of data, you've got about 1,500 you've got 1,600 items in there. You've got the yellow is the most common load, so it's the single weight that is most common. And in this case, it's 8 kilos, and you've the bar is the same height as for all the averages. That's something which it's quite difficult to make sense of, but overall, I felt it was the easiest way to do that. Then the median load is the one that's bang in the middle. So you arrange half the loads are lighter, half the loads are bigger. So that's the mid range of the load. And then you've got and that's the spread between those things reflects the variability in your loads, and itself is potentially quite useful information. And then you also want to look at the spread of the load. So I've included these 2 pinky bars for 25th percentile and 75th percentile. so you can see how variable loads are. And the final thing is the carry factor, which is the pale blue bar on top of the dark blue bar. Now, be aware that anything that if you put a carry distance of less than 2 meters, we don't consider that to be carry, so that will be ignored. And the figures at the bottom also give you an indication of total load, total number of carries, and the total carry distance for the whole data set. So you then have to consider the overall color band, and what we've done is we've taken the worst case scenario. You can see that the maximum load is in the amber, mean load is in the amber, 75th percentile load is in the amber, as is the mean load plus carry factor, which basically means that the overall score comes out as amber. And the idea then is that you can then copy that into your max score sheet, and then carry on with addressing the other risk factors. Just realize this is the previous version of the score sheet, but the most recent version of the MAC has a slightly different version, I think. Now, I'll briefly talk about the advantages and disadvantages of VMAC. I mean, in some ways, it's all very obvious. So VMAC, it's useful where weights handled a variable. We've deliberately tried to make it give it a lot of familiarity because it's designed to integrate with the MAC. The only data you need to use the VMAC are the item weights, the number of items handled in a day, and the average carry distances for particular tasks. And you use it to assess lifting over the whole lifting and carrying over the whole working shift. Now, when you've got somebody handling in a burst, so they spend an hour unloading a trailer, go off and do something completely different, and then come back and do something else, do more, say that they're loading a couple of hours later, then it can cope with that because it's taking the average over the day. It's doing the assessment over the day. We can take account of different shift lengths. The boundaries are adjusted based by the shift length. It does include an allowance for breaks, and you can use it to show how the risk changes when you make changes to the handling task. So you can ask what if questions. So saying, well, if we get rid of this particular load or whatever, then what does that do to the risk? The limitations are it doesn't take into account the distance or time when people are walking around in your warehouse. Say they've loaded something onto a conveyor or trailer and they're having to walk back to get the next one. It doesn't take account of that factor, and it doesn't take account of the exertion involved in pushing and pulling, so things like pump trucks and roll cages. Basically the VMAC is available for download from within the MAC website. There are links. It's all been written, so you should be able to navigate it quite easily. There's information on how to use it. It's kind of stuff I've been talking about. When to use it, advantages and limitations. There's a series of worked examples which you can download. They are designed to work together. So you see that it's a number of tasks, and as you gradually build up the task, they all add together. There's some frequently asked questions, and there are links to the background reports from the development work, which do get rather detailed and technical. But so most people won't need them, but they are there for those that do want them. And I'll also mention briefly the fact that HSE has been developing an online version of the VMAC tool, which is, I think it's very, very close to the final launch. It actually combines the VMAC, the ART tool, assessment of repetitive tasks, and RAPP tool, risk assessment of pulling and pushing, as an all-in-one digital solution. Basically, you've got the 3 tools integrated into one app, which you can put onto a mobile device such as a smartphone. And the idea is that it allows people doing assessments to well, simplify the process, so you can handle more data more easily on a digital device, not without handling lots of pieces of paper. And obviously it's that saving time, and it helps, well, it helps the assessor understand, interpret, categorize, and communicate the risk. So these are just some screen grabs from it. So there is potential for a version which can be customized, so you can put your own company logo in. And you can see it takes you through the individual risk factors, such as team handling, grip on load, and then it gives you an output score with the color coding. Now, there's a free version, which is the equivalent of the printed booklets. So they will continue to be available. The free version is there so that people who want to try the VMAC, want to use it for if they need to do assessments is relatively limited, then the paper version is perfectly fine. We're not taking that away, but we're aware that some people will be doing a lot more assessments, and therefore a digital tool that helps manage that kind of assessment is potentially extremely valuable. Therefore, we thought, well, let's see if well, basically it is a paid for product, but it does give you significant added value. So it does allow you to tailor how you use it to fit your company's organizational structure. It can be there is a mobile app so you can complete assessments offline. It's GDPR compliant as is absolutely necessary, so data is stored securely and safely. And it has reporting functions in there which will allow you, the manager, to look across the whole organization to identify areas with particularly high risk, for instance. And no, HSE does not get to look at your results. The version is there to help you manage multiple assessments. So improve monitoring, prioritization, you can identify the themes that are coming out, and you can filter the reporting by site or by type of task, etc. And that it's available for download from the HSE website. There are monthly webinars which demonstrate it, which are free, and I think there was one only a day or two ago, so the next one will be towards the end of October. The website there does list the features for the free version and the premium version, and does give pricing for the premium version, which does depend on the volume of assessments and number of users that are using it. I think it's deliberately meant to be straightforward. So at that point, I've said enough. I think it's time for Lee to hand over to Lee and see what questions you've all come up with.
Andrew, yeah, fascinating. I've never looked into the VMAC in that much detail myself over the years. Did use MAC a few years ago, but never really looked into VMAC. And looking at the comments in the chat, I can see that there are lots of people who are enthused by it, and that they think that they will probably use that in their workplaces moving forward. So there's loads and loads of questions. I'm not sure we'll even have time to get through them all. I think you touched upon this on your last slide. Is the VMAC downloadable from the HSE website?
Yes, it is.
I know you're not an inspector, but would the HSE, would they look to take into account the VMAC if they were doing any enforcement visits, or if they were doing accident investigations or RIDOs, etc.? Would they look at using the VMAC?
They could do, yes. It would depend on the particular circumstances, but if there's handling is very, very variable, then I think they'd be more likely to say to the duty holder, right, right, we'll talk you through it. Here's a VMAC. Now you find some of your data, download it into it, and let's see what comes up.
Yeah, I think that would probably be the case. This is more of an observation than a question, and I guess everybody will have heard this before. In my last job, we had to carry drain pipes 3 meters in length, 10 kilograms in weight. I used VMAC and RAPP tools, and it came up purple. I reported it to management and was told, well, that's the way we've always done it. Sorry,
the 3 meters in length and weighing 10 kilograms?
Yeah. I'm assuming it was a team.
I'm just trying to think which. I'd need to look at the MAC graph to be certain what was going on there. If something is genuinely coming up as purple, then it would have been very high frequency for that. Yeah. And well, management saying that's the way we've always done it is not controlling risk. So I would recommend that management actually take a more positive attitude to control of risk before my colleagues from HSE come and call.
I totally agree. And you know, if the person who's done the assessment happens to mention that to the HSE when they're on site, then the employer could be on a very sticky wicket.
Indeed.
When will the digital tool be available?
I think a version is available already. I'm not sure of precise timescales. It's just, unfortunately, I think this is one of the things where getting it published is a bit of a moving feast. It's been imminent for a little while.
Okay. Do you think the VMAC could be used for supermarket deliveries, short bursts of activity with variable carrying distances?
Absolutely, yes.
That was a close question, wasn't it, I suppose?
Yeah. Well, the supermarket distribution is one of the activities which does fit very well with using the VMAC.
Perfect. And I know we do have some participants on the call from some of the largest supermarkets in the country, shall we say? So yeah, I suppose they're taking that with interest. Does the average of the accumulative load, e.g., if employees pick into a cage and the cage ends up as 500 kilograms, so do you take all that into account, the weight of the cage, etc.?
The weight of the cage would be relevant to pushing and pulling it, but if you're moving it around on an order picker, low-level order picker, then that's mechanical handling, so isn't an issue. It's the weights of the items you're putting into the cage.
Okay.
But I mean, if somebody's having to push loaded cages long distances, then I'd recommend using the RAPP tool for that. Yeah.
In a former life, when I was an inspector, I observed someone moving a roll cage over rough terrain. So the supermarket delivery onto the road, and then pushing it over rough terrain, and then up a slope into the supermarket.
Yeah.
So
that kind of scenario, I think everyone realises is quite challenging, and unfortunately, without well, possibly rebuilding the supermarket, or at least improving the access, it can be very, very, very difficult to implement changes.
Yeah, what we tried to do, we tried to get the order pickers. So from the warehouse, we tried to get them to load the cage to a certain height, not above a certain height. But the problem was that was all well and good, but when the drivers got to site, they hadn't, the people in the warehouse hadn't really bothered to do that. So they're pushing, you know, roll cages full of heavy stock up inclines. So yeah, that was an interesting one. I can't go into too much detail, but yeah, let's just say they ended up with some improvement notices. Is there a worked example of the VMAC spreadsheet?
There are 4 worked examples on the HSE website. Yes.
Yeah. Someone said that the concern is advice is not to assess part-time workers and temporary workers. Surely, if they are inexperienced, are they at greater risk of injury?
They would be, yes. But in general, we're recommending assessing the task for the typical worker, and then taking account of the less experienced ones, the ones at a greater risk. Once you've understood the risk to the ordinary workers.
And if you were to use the VMAC to observe order picking in a warehouse, what sort of time period would you suggest looking at?
Collecting the data over the whole shift. So if you can get the data for the shift for the individual out of the warehouse management system, you can then put that into the VMAC spreadsheet.
Somebody asked that they have cable pulling on their site. Would the VMAC be used for cable pulling?
No, it wouldn't. Cable pulling is something that we have never actually had opportunity to look at well. There is a small amount of scientific literature out there. I would recommend for that task that you, do a full risk assessment, recognizing it is quite an unusual situation, and it's you've got issues around the friction of the cable. I mean, depending on what you're pulling it from or over. I mean, if you get taken over rough ground, for instance, I suspect it could be very difficult. It's the kind of thing which might involve multiple people. And if you can attach a mechanical winch, it might be better.
Okay. So it's going back to sort of first principles of manual handling, I suppose, isn't it?
That one would be, yeah. But it's quite a challenging thing to assess. And another factor that you'd be wanting to look hard at would be the risk of the feet slipping, because you're applying horizontal force.
Yeah. Let me just go into the chat. There's been a few more.
I see someone has just suggested using the RAPP for pulling cables. The RAPP, again, that's based on data which is more to the section on non-wheeled items, possibly, but the wheeled items thing is basically assuming that you got reasonably good wheels.
Okay.
But cable pulling is always going to be challenging.
Yeah. Perhaps that's something you could look into for your next project, Andrew. Maybe not then. Question from
prioritizes it.
Question from Claire. Apologies, Claire. I'm just going to read this out verbatim. We have pickers for food deliveries. The pickers never have to bend to pick up the load. They simply pick it from table height. It's automatically scanned and then they place it in the bag for the customer. This system looks like it's built for bending, picking up, and then carrying. Our pickers don't carry, but they do lift with a small amount of twisting. So what would you recommend using for these guys, as the weights they're lifting is variable?
If it's for home delivery, by the sound of it, then I suspect a lot of the items are really quite light. So the VMAC might not be very helpful anyway, because it's beyond the 2.5 kilo cutoff I suggested. But it does sound like someone's put a lot of hard work into designing good workstations, which eliminate a lot of the risk factors.
Yeah, yeah. I remember going into an order picking type environment years and years ago, and the employees were complaining about how they got their shoulders were aching and their backs were aching after doing this work for so many hours. And I asked the employees, I said, well, what do you think would make this better for you? And they said, well, if they just raised the height of the table. And lo and behold, they put something under the legs of the table to increase the height of the table, and then lo and behold, that seemed to do the trick. So I think you know, we all preach it and we all promote it. Talk to the employees. Often they have an idea of how to make these things better. You know, put it to them and just say, what could we do? What do you think we could do to make this better? And more often than not, they've got the good ideas.
Exactly.
Can this be used for pushing and pulling weight? We pick on pallet trucks and move weights in excess of 600 kilograms.
Push it. Pick on. Right. Okay. So if they're put on pallet truck, if they're putting a pallet onto the an ordinary hand pallet truck, the obviously it can be used for the actual picking aspect of it, but it wouldn't be. You'd need to use something like the RAPP tool for looking at the aspect of moving the loaded pallet on the pallet truck.
Yeah. Someone's put a comment in here, and I'm not sure you might want to answer it, but it says, surely if the intention is to reduce injuries and lost time, would it not make sense to provide the premium tool to businesses free of charge? You don't have to answer that if you don't want to. You claim the Fifth Amendment.
I'm not. Well, we're deliberately keeping the free version available. We make sure there is a free version, but well, I suppose it's a matter for a company to decide where it what's value for money in its own investment in terms of the cost of the tool.
Yeah.
I mean, to be honest, the biggest cost will be the staff time for doing the assessments.
Yeah. How suitable is this, I assume the VMAC and the MAC assessments, how suitable is it for assessments in a vehicle workshop environment where tasks are sporadic and very variable across the shifts?
I think that's a potentially that's a potential application. You might find that the total number of lifts over the shift is quite low, but yeah, I think it's certainly worth attempting to use it.
A question here: does the MSD Online automatically select MAC, RAPP, and ART as the company enters data without the company needing to pick the specific tool to use?
No, you need to identify the type of manual handling you're dealing with, and then select the specific tool. What we've done is we've taken the paper-based tools and turned them into electronic versions, and the routing within the online tool and the app basically allows you to select the one that you want to use.
So do you think the starting point would be the MAC tool then? And then moving on to the VMAC, if you've got variable weights.
Absolutely, yeah. I would always say use the VMAC with the MAC when it's appropriate, and a lot of times you don't need the VMAC.
Okay.
It's just in where you have got very variable weights and frequencies, then hopefully it will help you.
Yeah. Will you ever consider one tool for all?
I think that's a bit like saying I have a hammer, every problem is a nail. I think the thing with tools is you have to be able to select the right tool for the what you're doing, and you want a tool kit where the tools are accessible, which is why we're trying to integrate the tools into the online thing, so you can get to each of them easily as appropriate.
Does the VMAC tool take into consideration the environment? Some people work in manual handling in different elements, as in cold, ambient conditions, or construction sites in summer conditions, etc.
The VMAC itself doesn't, but the using the MAC tool with it, you then look at those factors.
Yeah, I expect the answer to the next one to be very short. Is the VMAC reliable?
It's as reliable as the data you put in.
I would have just said yes, seeing as I was the one that developed it.
There is inevitably this kind of science, there is a degree of uncertainty in the data, but it's the best we've got. And if somebody can help us by finding better data, we're happy to look at it. But
yeah, but it is very reliable.
We would like to think so, but we are aware that there's a lot of uncertainty in what causes people to be injured. There's a lot of factors affect it, and the MAC and VMAC are only addressing some of those factors.
Okay. I think that's about it, Andrew. There's been some terrific debates in the chat, and I did see a lot of people early on saying that they are definitely going to use this in their working environments. So yeah, appreciate you taking the time out to talk about that for us.
Yeah,
it is a very technical subject, but I do genuinely feel that people have got some use out of that, and I think people will be taking that forward with them into their work environments.
Yeah.
So we'll call that a wrap then. If anybody's got any questions after the webinar, or if there's any questions that I've missed either in the chat or in the Q&A, both myself and Andrew are on LinkedIn. You can find us on there. I'm sure if you get the questions to me, I can send them to Andrew, or Andrew is on LinkedIn himself, so I'm sure we'll be able to get the answers. The recording will be put onto the IOSH YouTube channel, normally in a couple of days, and I think that Andrew's very kindly offered to allow the slides to be shared. So yeah, I think we'll call that a wrap. Our next IOSH Logistics and Retail webinar is on the 12th of October, where we'll be discussing prevention of slips and trips with Christian Harris from Slip Safety Services. So that promises to be a good one. I've been on one of his presentations before. He's a very passionate guy. You can register for that via the link on our IOSH and Logistics LinkedIn page. So Andrew, I'd just like to wrap up by saying thank you. Really fascinating, certainly something I'm going to look into a lot more deeper. And thanks everybody for the chat and the questions. Some real good engagement. We did, I think I saw we got up to about 288 people at one point. So brilliant, well done. Thank you for taking the time out to do that, Andrew. And that formally ends today's webinar. So thank you all for attending. Please do complete the webinar feedback. Cheers.